everyone. Hi. I have the great pleasure of introducing Lyndsey Stonebridge. Lyndsey Stonebridge is a prolific writer, a critic, and a professor of humanities and human rights at the University of Birmingham in the UK. She's also a vocal critic and a journalist in the public sphere. And, of course, an Arendt scholar, a scholar on the work of Hannah Arendt. She's written about human rights, about the judicial imagination, but also about poetry and literature and what Hannah Arendt has to say about those subjects. For instance, in her recent book, We Are Free to Change the World, which came out in 2024, and I warmly recommend as a biography on Hannah Arendt. I think that what characterizes Lyndsey Stonebridge's work is that the sense of being a scholar, not in Arendt's sense of a professional thinker, but as someone who seeks out and creates a space of appearance, who seeks public venues and who nourishes public debate. I'm very, very much looking forward to her talk, and I'm also looking forward greatly to her latest book, which apparently she just told me is a book on old women. So enjoy.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, if I tend to talk quite quickly when I'm excited, so if I do that and you can't hear me, wave, and I'll wave back. There's a really important word in Hannah Arendt's lexicon, and that word is joy, which she uses in the human condition. And by joy, she doesn't mean just being happy, or just being joyous. She means joy in the face of despair and suffering and misery and hopelessness, and the kind of joy you can feel together. And I really feel joyous to be here in that sense. And coming from the outside, I must say, to create a joyous community, which I think is what happens at Bard and at the Hannah Arendt Center, is quite something. On the subject of joy, I'm aware, as Arendt's biographer as well, we're really close to cheese and wine. She really liked giving people nibbles and hospitality. And I can hear us saying, don't talk for too long, these people need to drink. So I'm not going to talk for too long. I think over the last 2 years, and I'm thinking here about Ukraine and Gaza and the desperate violence, global violence we've been seeing, I felt kind of neither cosmopolitan nor particularly tribal, just bewildered and shattered. I always think there's an essay that Sigmund Freud wrote at the beginning of World War I, in the middle of World War I, and he says the problem with war on this level is that time gets disjointed. You can't tell the difference between past and future. You can't form judgments about the impressions being forced into your mind. He talks about bewilderment. He also talks in that essay about how a tribal primitivism seems to return during war. Simone Weil, in the Second World War, wrote, "The mind ought to find a way out, but the mind has lost all capacity to so much as look outward." And I kind of think, like a lot of people I suspect in this room, that's how I felt for a lot of the last 18 months. That thought in mind, there were two passages from Arendt's archive. I've just published a book on a biography of Arendt, so I spent a lot of time in her archive. But there are two passages from her archive that over the last year in particular I've hung on to. And the first is from June 1967, and it's just before the outbreak of the Six-Day War. And in June 67, there was a letter published in the New York Times by groups of intellectuals, including Ralph Ellison, Marianne Moore, Lionel Trilling, Ivan Howe, everyone you can think of those there, and of course Hannah Arendt, which said the crisis in the Middle East is for the United States and the rest of the world a crisis of law and conscience. Hannah Arendt's name was at the top of that list because it's A. And several weeks later, she was asked to join an association called the American Professors for Peace in the Middle East. And she said, yes, certainly, of course. You know, she's an American professor and she wanted peace in the Middle East. Go to October and you get a letter from Hannah Arendt to gentlemen of the American Professors of Peace in the Middle East, and she says, take me off your list. I don't want anything else to do with you. She says, and I quote, it looks as though the American Professors for Peace in the Middle East are a Zionist organization, a Zionist front organization. She's been misled. And then she writes, and this is a sentence I've had in my head, I am and have always been pro-Israel. This does not mean that I have become a Zionist or wish to join the kind of organization you have obviously established. I have and will always defend Israel's right to exist, but I'll have none of your tribal nationalism. The second passage is more existential and phenomenological. I mean, Arendt always writes from experience, and for me, it's Arendt as a writer that takes me to the most interesting places in terms of thinking. So you kind of have to go with her, and she takes you into some very strange places, but it's because she's such an amazing writer. And this is from a letter to Karl Jaspers from 1957. And she says to Jaspers, she says, and I quote, alienation and rootlessness, if we only understand them aright, make it easier to live in our time. Alienation and rootlessness, if we only understand them right, make it easier to live in our time. And we certainly should allow ourselves that little bit of relief. They're like a skin that grows onto us from the outside. And because of that skin, we can afford to remain sensitive and vulnerable. So alienation and rootlessness might make it easier to live in our time. They're like a skin that grows onto us from the outside, and because of that skin, we can afford to remain sensitive and vulnerable. When I first read this, I thought, wait, what? Hang on, alienation and rootlessness are good things? And this feels so counterintuitive. What's she talking about? They're bad things. But she says if we understand them right, and then you get that extraordinary idea of growing a skin that allows us to remain sensitive and vulnerable. And I think what Arendt is so helpful for today is the way she accepts alienation and rootlessness as a way of resisting the siren calls of tribalism and its self-defeating promises. I mean here tribalism, I mean in political tribalism, I mean tribal nationalism. Negative tribalism, as Sebastian so helpfully termed it this morning. Arendt understood keenly that she lived, stood, existed, thought, and felt in a particular moment in the modern history of the relationship between tribalism and cosmopolitanism. And I think Khaled was absolutely right this morning when he made this point earlier, that it's a particular history of tribalism and cosmopolitanism, and we're right in the middle of that history. That's how Arendt understood. And I think it's because she understood herself to exist in that moment was why she consistently refused both political tribalism and cosmopolitanism, and why she insisted, often bloody-mindedly and always with great, great clarity, on occupying the space between them. She knew how to keep her skin intact. In 1957, she also wrote, she said, our present is emphatically, and not merely logically, the suspense between a no longer and a not yet. What begins now, after the end of the history of the world, is the history of mankind. What this will eventually be, we do not know. Now, by the end of the history of the world, she meant the end of cosmopolitan history in the sense of Western universalist sense that Kant had made possible. And that in her mind, imperialism and totalitarianism had smashed up. By the history of mankind, she meant a plural politics to come, which we don't know. I'm hoping that Sheila Ben Habib's talk tomorrow will help us think that through. But her own moment was, she says, emphatically, a moment of suspense. And she wasn't the only person, she wasn't the only woman, interestingly, who was thinking in that space in the mid-20th century. I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'm just going to add it because it's occurred to me. I've been thinking all day about where women fit in to the opposition between tribalism and cosmopolitanism. Women are often markers of the tribe's limits and policed as such. But there's not straightforwardly a place for women in cosmopolitanism. And Arendt was not the only woman thinker to occupy that middle space. I was thinking a lot today also of Simone Weil, the French mystic and philosopher contemporary of Arendt, who wrote just before her death a book called The Need for Roots. She wrote it during the war. She actually wrote it as part of de Gaulle's Free French movement. It's an amazing book. It's just recently been retranslated, and the retranslation is well worth a read. But she was absolutely emphatically against tribalism and imperialism. She was looking for a version of roots which was set aside from imperialism and tribalism. I'm thinking of Suzanne Césaire, who critiqued, along with Aimé Césaire, the kind of Western French cosmopolitan humanism that they were being asked to defend during World War II. Be in permanent readiness for the marvellous, Césaire said. And I was thinking very much of Virginia Woolf, who's actually a writer Arendt really liked and read. And I was thinking particularly of Woolf's essay, long essay from 1938 called 3 Guineas. And in that book, her conceit is she's asked to support the movement for peace by a young liberal cosmopolitan, you could say. And Woolf says, no, I'm not. I'm not going to support that tradition because I want to step outside of those traditions that seem to be feeding destruction. So it's a beautiful essay, and it reads very, very contemporarily today, partly because it's about pacifism, partly because it's about feminism. And she's also very famous for that quote, which you hear a lot. She says, as a woman, I have no country. My country is the whole world. That quote used to really irritate me because as a white, upper-class English woman writing in 1938, her kind of country was the whole world. So I thought, yeah, okay, Virginia. But the sentiment, I think, what she was trying to say there, she said, we want to be a society of outsiders that pushes against that. And the other irony of that is as a woman, I have no country, my country is the whole world. In the first United Nations Conference on Women and Human Rights in Beijing, I can't remember that, I think it's 1981, that as a woman, I have no country was used on all the Merc. So it was on mugs and things like that, so all these women carrying around Virginia Woolf. And I kind of wonder where a lot of women in the world think they've gone with that. And I think it's a really urgent question when misogyny is so much part of contemporary political tribalism. But it's really unremarked. It's just in your face at the moment. It's just there, and no one's talking about it. It's happening in front of our eyes. So I think you could put a whole list of other thinkers along with Arendt who occupy a historical break or suspense or pause between tribalism and cosmopolitanism. And I think the question for now, which is the brilliant question posed by this conference, is are we still in that moment of suspense? Or are we witnessing the end of a certain kind of cosmopolitanism? And if we're looking at the end of a certain kind of cosmopolitanism, what does it look like? How can we live in it without giving in to the forces of political tribalism? And above all, and this is Arendt's question, how can we keep ourselves sensitive and vulnerable? I'm sure a lot of you had this feeling, because I know a lot of very serious Arendt readers in the room, but reading Arendt over the last couple of years has felt like walking on ice that might crack open at any moment. You know you're looking into the deep black of the past, but there's a feeling that you might be plunged back into that past at any moment. Particularly bewildering, to use Freud's phrase, has been the return of tribal nationalism or negative tribalism. And what I really value about Arendt is the way she saw that kind of tribalism for what it was: self-defeating, destructive, a political and historical cheat. Tribalism, modern tribal nationalism, she said, promises a return to roots, but in reality it thrives on conditions of rootlessness. Tribalism is a kind of cheap glue binding the fearful, lonely, and atomized together. But the thing to know is that the glue is a fix, not a foundation. And in the case of 20th century Europe, that turned out to be a bodge job of tremendous proportions, wrecking, in Arendt's now famous account, the European nation-state itself. So far from grounding people to a common earth, tribal nationalism cuts them free from reality, gathering passions together in the intensity of its fiction-making. You either belong or you don't, goes the tribalist story. The tribe is surrounded by enemies, then Jews, migrants, Ukrainians, leftists, the bourgeoisie, queer people, enemies from within. Now, Jews, Palestinians, Ukrainians, leftists, global capitalism, LGBT+, fantasy pet neighbors, and enemies within. Hence the justification for imperialism, local and international, occupation, finally genocide. Liberal individualism is for wimps and shifty elites. The law is only the law when it serves the tribe. That's a sort of paraphrase of the middle sections of Origins of Totalitarianism. Sorry. What she understood, I think, very clearly, that we're seeing again, is that close connection between violence and tribalism. For Arendt, and then, political and ideological tribalism does the opposite from what it advertises. Come home, it says, be safe, grow some roots, but in reality, tribalism has to keep on moving in order to keep on generating its own dark ferocity. Indifferent to reality, tribalism denies the very possibility of a common humanity in both theory and in practice. For the past 100 years, I think it's been a profoundly destructive, not a conservative or creative point. As Keller's point again, a point about modern history. Here is Orwell. I think Orwell and Arendt often march in lockstep on this matter. Him describing tribal nationalism in 1946, and he says, actions are held to be good or bad, not on their own merits, but according to who does them. And there is almost no kind of outrage, torture, the use of hostages, forced labor, mass deportations, imprisonment without trial, forgery, assassination, the bombing of civilians, which does not change its moral color when it is committed by our side. Here is Arendt in 1949. Tribalism and racism are the very realistic, if very destructive ways of escaping the predicament of a common responsibility. Both of those sentences could have been written this week. That's my point. And if you've doubted, if you go back to the middle section of Origins of Totalitarianism, then go look at Putin's essay from 2021. It's easy to find. It's on the Kremlin website. And it sounds, I mean, actually it sounds slightly even more deranged than the tribal nationalism that Arendt described, but it is there, it's in plain sight, it's right in front of our noses. Given that context, it's small wonder that Arendt opted for rootlessness and alienation. But the rootlessness she practiced, as Roger made so clear this morning, was emphatically not that of the cosmopolitan elite. We got tribalism, she says, because the promises of cosmopolitanism were already broken, and with them, its authority. Again, she's ahead of the game. It was Kant, wasn't it, who argued that the dream of universal rights crashed with the brutal hypocrisies of colonialism. Notice it's Kant himself who said that. He didn't need anyone else to point it out. The point that Thomas was making earlier is that one of the cosmopolitan traditions is self-criticism. That's where it comes from. One of the key principles of cosmopolitanism was, a violation of right on one place of the earth is felt by all, and Kant's point was you can't do that when you're violating the rights of black and brown people in other places of the world. It's self-critique. Arendt took Kant's point one stage further. She says the tragedy was, and I quote, was when Europe began in all earnest to prescribe its laws to other continents, coinciding in the moment that Europe had already lost its own belief in them. Europe ended up exporting its own processes of violent disintegration and a botched-up model of the nation-state as the only possible model of government. Other forms of political knowledge, principally from the global south, were actively suppressed as, in a grotesque irony, Europe sold the world its own version of tribal nationalism. So Arendt was always hugely skeptical about the possibilities of a post-war cosmopolitanism. And, if you look again, Origins of Totalitarianism, there's a bit where she says, the thing you have to realize, and she's writing just as the Human Rights Declaration is being drafted, just as all these things are being put into place, she says, look, there is no realm in international law that's above sovereign territories, treaties, and engagements. It doesn't exist. And I think we're seeing that again today. Again, she was prescient. She says, true enough, she said in the 50s, we now have a common present. And then she says, but given we have no common past, does it really make any sense to talk of a common future? True, too, she says, that technology was bringing the world closer and closer together. But then she warned us that the same technology of global communication was designed side by side with the technology of global destruction. She worried about a shallow unity. What if global neighborliness, too much communication, she asked, led us to hate one another even more? What if, in other words, cosmopolitanism turned out to be as monstrous as tribalism? As we've heard, as I think we can see today, we are in those kind of last days of that moment. And I was struck by a lecture that I'm sure some of you read that Pankaj Mishra gave in Ontario last month. He was describing there how Gaza has finished the job begun with the war in Iraq of shattering the assumptions held by commentators, policymakers and journalists in the West, that the West was holding the line for humanism and democracy. The cosmopolitanism in its Western forms could guarantee rights for all. Arendt, I think, foresaw that change. I really don't think she was a post-war liberal in the way that she's been characterized in that way, and she wasn't a Cold War liberal in that sense. Instead, in her own time, and this is what I found really valuable over the last year, is her ability to stay in her own time, in the between times of tribalism and cosmopolitanism. And in that way, I think she worked to keep the future possibilities of a genuine political plurality open. Her refusal to be tribal in a political public sense was part of that. That's part of the reason she wrote that letter to the American professors for peace in the Middle East. She refused the constellations of political tribalism, even as she embraced the tribalisms of love and friendship. And even if that meant staying with a certain notion of rootlessness, because she thought that in between times she found herself in, that was a way of staying human. She kept her skin intact, and I hope that we have the courage to do the same. Thank you.
Hi. Hi. Does this work? Yes, great. So we're going to have a mini conversation now, and then welcome questions from the audience. Thank you so much for this kind of opening of so many different kind of avenues that we could pursue in thought here. One of the things that you highlighted in Arendt, I think, is the kind of cognates that the word tribe has for her in books like Origins of Totalitarianism, and largely the notion of the tribe doesn't fare well, right? There is the association with race, with nation, family, dynasty, house, clan, folk. And the particular context in which she discusses tribal nationalism in particular is that of the Boers in South Africa, right? So this kind of proto-fascist almost tribalism, and as you said, she highlights in particular rootlessness as the quality of this kind of tribalism. Or the kind of precondition for it. So one way to think about tribes, and that we might be tempted to think about it, and I think that some of the people at this conference want to think about it, is as fulfilling a certain human need. A need for belonging, let's say, a need to have a place, a need for family, for for human warmth, right? But as you highlighted in your talk, Arendt refuses this kind of essentialism. And so what I want to ask you is how we can think belonging differently with Arendt. So what forms of warmth, of familiar feeling, of belonging does Arendt offer us outside of and in opposition to the tribe?
Does this work? Yeah? Thanks. Yeah, that's a really great question, because I think you're right, she does refuse. And I get nervous about thinking we can somehow escape from the modern history of tribalism and move somewhere into somewhere else. But in a sense, she answers your question. So I always think the origins of totalitarianism is a kind of work of archive fever. She's gathering together. She lived this moment. It's kind of profoundly biographical in lots of ways. And that's why she wanted to understand it. She wanted to understand, to deconstruct the nature of what the world was living. The book after that was The Human Condition. And I think that kind of answers your question. And I kind of think that The Human Condition is her love song to the world. And she talks there about the love of the world, and she wanted to call it the love of the world. And she also talks about world alienation and how we've become alienated from the human world that we make together. And she thinks that's terrifying. But then she describes the nature of that human world, the things we make together, the things we labor at together, as a kind of lasting world. I mean, the world is made human. So I think that's one way. You know, it's neither cosmopolitan or tribal. It's being in the world. And the other part of that, I think, has become, she also talks about the human condition, and it's become increasingly important. She says, as important is earth alienation. So not just the human world, the earth. And there's the beautiful bit at the beginning of The Human Condition where she describes Sputnik going around the world, and she says, why would you want to escape the world? This is mad. I always think of that passage. She's watching Sputnik go up and saying, everyone's thinking, not actually being really pleased about this. Part of the reason that people weren't pleased in New York is because the Soviets had got there first. They might have been happier about it had it been the Americans who got there first. But she said there's almost like a sense of relief that we can now leave the planet. And every time Elon Musk says, colonize Mars, I think of the opening to The Human Condition, of that kind of, why do you want to escape either the human world that we've made together or the life world, which is, again, a world of difference and distinction that we can be in. So I think her kind of rootedness, because she did believe in rootedness, came in The Human Condition.
There was a sort of ambivalence or there were different valences attached to the word rootedness and uprootedness in your talk, right? So it sort of, it required us to almost think of rootedness and uprootedness in the same kind of breath. Can you say more about how Arendt thinks, basically, because this is not just specific to the word rootedness and uprootedness, right? This is a feature of her thought that you highlight beautifully in your book too.
Yeah, she's going to refuse us the easy option of either. So if you look at what she says about tribal nationalism, it's selling a dream of roots, but it thrives off uprootedness. But it also produces it, because it keeps on having to, otherwise it has got no power. And you're quite right, she does this, she kind of unroots us as readers and thinkers. Just when you think you've got somewhere with Arendt, and then you write it down in your book, and then you go and edit it, and you read something else, you think that was completely wrong. She saw me coming. Actually, Virginia Woolf does this for me too, as well. Just as you think, you got it. You're thrown into a different thought pattern. And I think what she'd call that was probably, it's a kind of restlessness and thinking. So as she says in The Life of the Mind, she quotes Plato, it's that kind of sense of thinking she has is like the dream of a man who dreams overnight that he solved the problem of everything. Then he wakes up in the morning and realizes it was just a dream. And he has to start all over again. It's that kind of restlessness and refusal to get to a place, which is an ethical position. But at the same time, if you look at her politics, she's very small c conservative in terms of what she wants to do, is create the spaces where it's possible to have that kind of thinking and that kind of freedom. So she will say, you need nation states in which people can be together. You do need borders. You need laws. You need things that allow certain types of freedom, but precisely in order so that you can have the restlessness and refusal that she identifies with freedom.
I was very glad that you brought up the topic of genocide. So there's I recently I read a book by a new book by Anna Byrne on the concept of genocide, and I think it deserves a much larger audience. And it sort of, as I was reading it, it formed a question in my head that I think is very relevant to this conversation on tribalism. So Byrne basically argues that the confusion of democracy with the genos, with the tribe in modern nation states, causes the very aporia that gives rise to the tribal, and in fact gives rise to genocidal thinking. So she contends that because democracies lack a principle of time themselves, they borrow that principle from the structure of generational time to make up for the absence, and that this leads to a kind of double speak, where on the one hand, democracies disavow genos thinking and genocide, while also continuing to cherish the forms of genos life, so things like the nation, right? And I think what she shows in that book, and what you also mentioned, a point in your talk, was that the tribal isn't democracy's other. It's not the sort of exotic other of democracy or of cosmopolitanism, but at the heart of its current form. Anna Byrne is led to ask the question, what will it take to envision an anti-genocidal democracy by this? And the question that I want to ask you in a sort of adapted version is, how do we think about the problem of continuity in democracy? How do we imagine democracies to survive? How do we create lasting bonds and institutions? And how do we imagine community democratically?
I wish I could answer those questions. I was just going back to the genocide. Well, I'm trying to give myself time to think. In The Promise of Politics, Arendt really likes Homer. When October the 7th happened, I was reading a new translation of the Iliad, and I've forgotten her name, but it's a brilliant translation into English, and she's translated it, if the name will come to me, into iambic pentameter. So if you're an English speaker, it suddenly all sounds very compelling and brilliant and familiar, and it became so very quickly, and I could not read the book anymore. I just had to put it down because it was too much. And I was reminded, I went back to Arendt in Promise of Politics, when she talks about Homer and talks about the way that what Homer's doing in the Iliad. The great thing about the Iliad is you don't know who the baddie or the goodie is. You don't know which side he's on. Okay, so she said it's the first kind of remark of history. And she said what he's doing in that poem is putting the vanquished back where they've been annihilated. And then she says, the thing about annihilation is that you don't just annihilate a people, you've annihilated part of the world. So it's a self-defeating strategy. You've damaged yourself in doing that, because you have, you've taken away, you've vanquished part of the plurality of the world, which doesn't answer your question at all, but I just thought I'd mention it. But I think in terms of the democracy thing, I think she's very good on is resisting the lure of making the new. So she is, Mary McCarthy said, she's a conservationist, not a conservative. So she's the ultimate upcycler of recycling. So she'll take the bits of tradition that are important that she can think can work and says, okay, let's go back, but rough it up a bit, but keep it there. And I think there is that sense, I mean, of constantly wanting to change the world, invent the world, or make it new. And I think the great political value of Arendt, as well as ethical one, is she wasn't a fixer. She didn't want to fix. And it's so rare in our political discourse to have that. She wasn't alone. I mean, she's very similar to James Baldwin in this. When Baldwin talks about the importance of the constant in the world, and that how, it always strikes me as amazing that the New Yorker published 3 essays within about 5 months of each other, between 62 and 63. The first was The Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, that extraordinary piece of writing. The second was James Baldwin's The Far Next Time, and the third was Eichmann in Jerusalem. And all those 3, they came out at roughly the same time, and they're all saying something similar, which is look at what's under your nose and in front of you and work at preserving that. Whether it's Black America, the earth, the human world, they were all saying something incredibly similar at that juncture. And I don't think it's an accident that it's Baldwin and Arendt and Carson, who were the thinkers from the last century, who are most urgent now. I still haven't answered your question about democracy because I don't know, and if I did, I'd be doing something else like running the UN or something useful.
I think you're doing something very useful here. I mean, so maybe this is a question about the question of particularism versus universalism, right? What universals are valuable to hold on to in the face of a kind of violent particularism, yeah? If we think about tribalism that way. But I want to open the discussion for questions from the audience. So please feel free to raise your hand. Yeah, in the middle there with the white t-shirt.
Hi, my name is Arjun. I'm also from Dalton. And just during your presentation, you used the term tribal nationalism, and specifically when referring to either Orwell or Arendt. And I from my interpretation, it seems like it was used somewhat negatively, and I wanted to ask, like, what does tribal nationalism differ from tribalism, or like having a tribal identity?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I should have been clearer. So tribal nationalism for Arendt and actually for Orwell would be the isms of the 20th century. So Nazism, communism, nationalism in a kind of crude sense. Orwell would add Zionism, any kind of structure of belief that puts the believers and the adherents of that tribe ahead of everyone else. And Orwell makes a very good point. He says, actually, that kind of nationalism and tribalism is never about roots or identity, it's about power. Whereas, when Orwell talks about patriotism, Roger cited it this morning, or we want to talk about other forms of communitarianism or a kind of structure, maybe that's not about power. So tribal nationalism emerged in the 20th century to kind of fill, I mean, Arendt says it emerged to fill the gap that was opening up between, especially in Europe, when you had the creation of new identities after World War I through the kind of pretty arbitrary imposition of new nation states. You had rootlessness, you had massive unemployment, you had massive cynicism and disaffection with political elites. You had massive financial crises. Stop me if this sounds familiar. And a kind of tribal nationalism was created in order to bind people together with an increasingly centralized and alienating state. But it was a kind of fix. It was offering them roots. It's almost like people have been uprooted, and then someone comes along and says, I can give you some new roots. But actually, it's a con. It's not the roots that came, it's not the roots that were torn up by the Industrial Revolution or by imperialism or by versions of capitalism.
I mean, I guess the question also implies, what tribe are we speaking about here, right? Why aren't we speaking about tribes as in indigenous tribes, archaic tribes, historical tribes, continuing tribes of people outside of this framework of the kind of invention of the tribe through a certain brand of nationalism. Is that a question for you?
Yeah, I think it is, because it's also that moment where Kant says, but Arendt says it more clearly, and Jasper said it too, is at the moment one version of modern tribalism, going back to Khaled's point, this is modern stuff, suppressed other forms of political knowledge or other ways of being a tribe, or just doing the business of being a political community together. Doesn't necessarily have to be along lines of the conventional nation state. There are many more forms. And we don't even, we've only begun to listen to other forms of political knowledge and creation and organization. But maybe the questions come up, and I hope it comes up again tomorrow, is like, I mean, tribe is a word that is too tribal. It sort of does the thing that we don't want it to do, and it's just stretching our vocabularies a bit, I think, to try and move in and out of that.
Thank you. I have a kind of playful and pretty ignorant question, but I'm gonna try and articulate it as best as I can. So Arendt's quote, "There is no law above sovereign territory," got me thinking. It really connected with me, with what you were saying, asking the question about, are we moving away from cosmopolitanism and returning to tribalism? Right now we have somewhat of a cosmopolitanism structure with international law, and a lot of people say it's heavily enforced, whether rightfully or wrongfully so, by the United States. They haven't signed the ICC, but the US is criminally involved in the ICC. So I'm wondering, is our moving away from cosmopolitanism, is it because of a corruption of power? And would you say this is happening in Gaza? Is the US enforcing an agenda on human rights, or is it more politically driven for economic gain and, a political stance in the Middle East? How could that get worse? And how could the corruption of US politics be prevented?
Right. Yeah. I'm hoping that, I think Shayla will address some of those questions tomorrow, but I think in terms of human rights framework and human rights hegemony, I think Pankaj Mishra is right. Actually, the players at the moment in terms of making international law do things, whether you agree with the things they're doing or not, are coming from the global south. So I think the idea that the West is policing the world is, for a lot of the world, don't believe it. And if they do believe it, they're not impressed. And a lot of the rest of the world are beginning to police the world. And so I think that's a really fundamental change that Europe, as well as America, have not caught up with yet. Which might make you think, well, great, so it shows that the human rights framework was the right one, and here we go. But implicit in your question is all these things are always around power. So what we're seeing is a power shift.
I've been reading Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon recently for my seminar class, and I noticed that you talked a lot about rudeness and uprootedness within tribalism, and I wanted to talk about how flight could be a form of connecting to your roots. As I'm just finishing chapter 10, and I notice how the main character of the book uses his desire to flee his living situation to go back into where he comes from to sort of understand the roots that he comes from. And I wanted you talked about how she was a conservationist and how she applied looking into the past to create a better future. I wanted you to talk about how sort of progression and change can be a way of connecting to your past.
It's a really beautiful question that makes me want to go and read sonnet again very quickly. Robert Lowell wrote a poem for Hannah Arendt called Pigeons for Hannah Arendt, which is a translation of a Rilke poem. And the poem is basically about a pigeon flying out of its house. Nothing else really happens except all of Western history in the second stanza. And he said, it starts with something like, what is home but a moment of fluttering terror? And what Lowell is trying to get is the moment when the pigeon is in flight, just that moment. And what would it mean if we can capture that moment as a form of knowledge or understanding? And I think that's why he wrote it for Arendt, who of course was uprooted herself. But it wasn't sort of like from uprootedness to home. It's precisely what you said, is that moment of flight gives you that understanding of the moment of flight itself. And the other thing I always like about that poem is I always think Arendt's very good at having pigeon eyes. You know, the way that pigeons have to sort of go like that, and look at both things from both directions. So I think there is this whole tradition of knowledge, and Toni Morrison is brilliant at it as well, of articulating and putting into words those between spaces as forms of knowledge. And those forms of knowledge themselves, I think, create the possibilities for other futures, even as they're non-prescriptive about what those moments might be. I think Morrison shares that actually with Arendt.
Hi. So you mentioned earlier in your talk Simone Weil, who I really admire, and it got me thinking about the role of religion in like a healthy tribalism that we could imagine. And like I'm 21, and like all of my friends are atheists, basically. And so among my generation, religion is not super popular. And I'm wondering, like, if there's something that my generation could learn from a religious point of view. I guess I'm bringing this up because Simone Weil was a Jew, but was also really influenced by Catholicism. And I myself am also really influenced by Christian thought. And I'm wondering, like, if there's something there with religion and young people, and if that's an avenue towards like a healthy tribalism that incorporates a kind of cosmopolitanism, or like a way of accepting humans in all their forms.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think Weil, like Arendt in a way, Weil would not officially join the church because she didn't trust imperial Rome or big structures. And just as Arendt would refuse kind of public forms of identification, although I think she was a person of private, strong faith. Actually, over the Eichmann controversy, there was a moment of absolute scandal where one of the things that was rumoured to happen was that Arendt had secretly converted to Catholicism, and that was the source of all. But I think where Weil, and I think Arendt would agree with her on this, and maybe we'll get to your question, it goes back to something that Sebastian was saying this morning as well. Weil's faith came from what she thought was a quality of attention to the world. They both love Spinoza for this too. The quality of deep attention to the world. And I think and so that might be a moment of faith, it might just be an ethical moment, but it's a moment of attention. And when Sebastian was describing the imperialism or the harvesting of attention by social media, by big, powerful companies that are robbing us of the capacity to have attention. That's what they're doing. They're monetizing attention, and they're destroying our capacity for it. It might not be faith, but it might be, you know, the places you can nurture attention in faith, in prayer, or in reading, or in class, or in education, or doing some maths. They always thought you would teach everyone maths because it trains you up for good attention. Maths and poetry, two things we need. So in some ways, yes, but I would be very cautious about religion for that. You know, at what point does a religion, you know, so Vail says the great disappointment with Catholicism was imperial, you know, it suddenly became an imperialism of its own. It rejected imperial Rome, and then the Catholic Church, you know, enacted its same form of imperialism. She also quite scandalously for the time, criticized Judaism for under the same principle. Less great side of But I think the two together, Vail and Arendt, at this moment in time, are a very good place to be.
Hi, I wonder if you could flesh out a bit Arendt's conception of Zionism. I was struck by your comment that she was both someone who considered herself not a Zionist, very opposed to it, but also supportive of Israel's right to exist. I believe there are some Zionisms in the ether today that are just of that bare variety, without the religious or other roots, that just say that Israel has a right to exist. What more can you say about how Arendt conceived of Zionism and why she was hesitant to call herself one?
She wasn't always hesitant, but I think Roger gave a very good history of that this morning. So the way, you know, she worked for Zionist organizations, but she didn't like ethnic national states. That was her problem. But it was a no-brainer to her that it had to be a Jewish homeland, because Europe was not a Jewish homeland. So her loyalty at that point was to her identity as a Jew. I think when I read that passage, and I found it in the file, of how difficult it would be for her to say that. It wouldn't be difficult for Arendt, because she just said exactly what she wanted, but how difficult it would be for people to hear that today. And I did actually try this out with some students in Birmingham. I read that quote, and they got quite grumpy about it. She said, well, she can't support the right of Israel to exist and not be a Zionist. I said, yes, she can. I said, well, you support the right of the United Nations, United Kingdom to exist, but you're not a Brexiteer. And then one of them said, yeah, but you know, Britain's not a colonial settler state. And I said, well, I beg to go. I have news. A grandchild of Derry here. And I mean, so that the simple to answer your question is why people can't hear it is a kind of normalized anti-Semitism that is creeping in, where people cannot hear why those two propositions might not be a contradiction.
Thank you so much. Coming to the end of the day now, it occurs to me that in the first part of the day, we heard quite a bit about loyalty, and now in the second part of the day, we've heard more about love. I'm thinking about the skin that you so beautifully presented to us, Arendt's skin of alienation and rootlessness, that makes it impossible for us to resolve certain deep questions. I'm also thinking about skin in relationship to the earlier wonderful presentation on development and feeling, because the skin is a feeling place, right? Even with that alienation and rootlessness. So I'm wondering, how do you think that skin might function to help us discern the differences between loyalty and love, and how both might be needed.
I think you put it so beautifully yourself, actually. But I was struck because you have to be careful with skin. I was thinking of Ionesco's play, The Rhinoceros, which is an anti-fascist parable, written actually at the same time when Arendt was writing that sentence. And in the play, it's a kind of parable about watch it because you're fascists in your midst. And suddenly in this village, they start to notice that people are turning into rhinoceroses, and they're turning into really thick-skinned people. So the skin has grown too thick. So they've become brutal, and there's only one guy left. But what I like about the skin is the capacity to be touched. And going back to love, what Arendt's always trying to do is keep the pre-political conditions for plurality open. And her account of love, I think, does this so beautifully, because on the one hand, love is complete singularity. You know, no one's loved like we two have loved, you know, and that whole thing about never tell anyone about your love, because if you do, you'll spoil it all. It's an absolute privacy. And then she says, but that's what binds us together, because we all think we're unique in love. We're all together in love. It's that wonderful double between singularity and particularity, but it's in the name of love. And she never wanted a politics to be in the name of love, because she thought it would be disastrous. Because once you start deciding who you should love and who you shouldn't. But the absolute singularity of love that makes us one in common. And I was struck with the last presentation about that too. And I'm really pleased if we started off with, you know, sort of harder politics if we're ending the day with love. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. You had a question, right? Yeah. Thank you. I had a question about Arendt's critique of Western cosmopolitanism. You mentioned how there is this idea that the Western idea of the nation-state transpired, or in a sense was extended to other regions, and how it suppressed the indigenous thought, the indigenous political thought. But I was wondering about other aspects. You mentioned something about the development of mass communication along with mass destruction weapons, and you also mentioned the role of women in the post-war version of cosmopolitanism. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about the gender aspect of that, and also the technological aspect of cosmopolitanism, and how it relates to Arendt's critique of cosmopolitanism. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, Roger can talk about technology far better than I can on this, but in her essay on Carl Jasper's Citizen of the World, which I really recommend as a kind of reading text for this conference, I'm sure it already has been recommended, precisely that. And she talks about, you know, it looks like the development of radio and technology, and remember we're in the 50s here, beginning of computers, is great because we can start to communicate. But then she says it's the same technology that's bringing us nuclear war. It's the same technology that's alienating us from the world, because it has the capacity for reason to become scientized and technologized. So, you know, it's a double-edged thing. And we've really seen that with the internet. You remember those days, well, maybe you don't, I do, when the internet first happened and there was this great joy. You know, was it Hillary Clinton? Like, here comes everyone and you better watch out because now here comes democracy. And it was, yeah, not what we imagined, not what we really wanted, thank you very much. Everybody should go back a bit. The gender thing I put in, because just as I was listening today, I thought the place of women in tribalism, tribalist politics, is never happy. I don't think there are many women in modern tribal ideological politics that are in a happy place. And that's quite often because women are used to mark the boundaries of the tribe, to be policed as part of that, part of what a tribal identity would be. And also, I also think, you know, my point about the UN is, you know, at the moment, the women from Afghanistan are trying to bring a new crime of gender apartheid to the UN. But it's a long time coming, given what's been happening to women across the world. And the silence on what's been happening to women across the world is deafening.
I think love would have been a nicer ending. But
wine isn't even...
Wine is the ultimate ending. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you, Lyndsey Stonebridge.
Just a quick announcement. So there is wine and cheese outside. I want to thank all the student volunteers who've been running around and manning the stations today and doing the work. And also the team at the Arendts Center and all the people at Bard College who've helped make this happen. Thank you very much. We start tomorrow at 9:30, and I look forward to seeing you there. We have a great day planned tomorrow, so we'll see you at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Thanks very much.